Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in again to Bud's Hot Sports Takes with me, Bud. This week we're going to be doing, similarly to what we usually do, and that's, through the season we're going to give, the top five league leaders, and different stats, like passing, rushing, receiving, right? Again, because we're doing things, so that way we can tell you, like, who you should be picking, for your fantasy teams, right? And like I said, last week is first 4 weeks, kind of hard to tell, teams are, still trying to find themselves, which we'll be getting into that too. You'll hear a little bit about that later. And again, like I said, I do this for you guys, not for me. There's no links there saying, hey, click here to take you to, DraftKings or take you to FanDuel. There's none of that. Probably won't ever be any of that. I might do that, once I get to like 10,000 subscribers, but I got 2 subscribers currently, right? So I don't see that happening anytime soon, potentially ever, right? This is just something I'm passionate about, so I do for you guys. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Hopefully it's entertaining for those of you who do watch it. Um, but let's get down to business here. Let's talk about what's going on. So passing, Josh Allen, he had 300. He led the league with 394 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. He was sacked 1 time. He had 14 carries for 30 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Now, granted, these are your league leaders through week 1. There's only been 1 week, so obviously these are also your weekly leaders, right? Geno Smith, which was one of the 2 quarterback recommendations that I made last week, if you remember. He passed for 362 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown. He threw for 1 interception. He was sacked 4 times, and he had 2 carries for 10 rushing yards. Justin Herbert, he threw for 318 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. He was sacked 3 times, and he had 7 carries for 32 rushing yards. Michael Penix Jr., he threw for 298 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, sacked 1 time, and had 6 carries for 21 rushing yards and 1 rushing TD as well. Joe Flacco, at number 5 in what was the Ohio Joe showdown, in my opinion, as we had 2 teams for Ohio playing against each other. The Cleveland Browns, Joe's team, or Joe Flacco's team, and Cincinnati Bengals, who was Joe Burrow's team. So the Ohio Joe showdown is what I call that. But anyway, both teams, led by quarterbacks named Joe. And Flacco, he threw for 290 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 2 interceptions. He was sacked twice and had 2 carries for 6 rushing yards. Rushing, we have, and yes, I'm aware I didn't mention as a suggestion last week, and there is a reason for that. Derek the King Henry did what he has always done his whole career and put on a show. I just don't usually suggest him as, unless he's facing a very weak rushing defense team, because in both DraftKings and FanDuel's, they always request so much for him. Usually he's the one or one or two. So he's usually in the top 2, usually in both of those, what they're usually requesting for him. And it's just so high that there's other options to really get and save your money and use elsewhere. But that's why I didn't do it. So, he's always a smart pick because he's going to produce. He might have 1 or 2 games the entire season that, okay, he didn't produce, but that's it. So, he done what he always does. Derek the King Henry, he rushed for 169 rushing yards on only 18 carries. That's a 9.4 yard average. And he had 2 rushing TDs to go along with that. And he also had one reception for 13 yards. And everything was not golden, as he did have one fumble. Travis Etienne Jr. had 143 yards on only 16 carries for a pretty close 8.9 yard average. He also had 3 receptions for 13 yards, but he had no fumbles and no touchdowns. Breece Hall, coming in at third in the league and also our last 100-plus yard rusher for the week, as he had 107 rushing yards on 19 carries for a very respectable 5.6 yard average. And he had 2 receptions for 38 yards to go along with it. He also had no fumbles and no touchdowns. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, the 7th round pick in the draft, is currently 4th in the league in rushing with 82 rushing yards on just 10 carries for another outstanding average of 8.2 yards. He also had 1 rushing touchdown, and he had no receptions and no fumbles. Jonathan Taylor had 71 rushing yards on 18 carries for a 3.9 yard average, and he had 3 receptions for 27 yards, and he had no fumbles and no touchdowns. Receiving, Zay Flowers is your receiving yard leader, as he had 143 receiving yards on just 7 receptions on 9 targets for a 20.4 yard average and 1 receiving touchdown. He also had 2 carries for 8 yards. Puka Nacua, he had 130 receiving yards on 10 receptions on 11 targets for a 13 yard average and 1 carry for 1 yard. He had no fumbles, no touchdowns. Jackson Smith Najigba, sorry if I butchered your name. That last name, it eludes me on how you really pronounce that. But he had 124 receiving yards on 9 receptions on 13 carries for a 13.8 yard average. He had no carries and 2 fumbles with no touchdowns. Keon Coleman, who was supposed to be consensus number 1 option for the Bills last year, but had a rather mediocre year, is now 4th in the league this year through week 1 with 112 receiving yards on 8 receptions on 11 targets for a 14-yard average and 1 receiving touchdown. No carries, no fumbles to go with it. CeeDee Lamb, despite the drops and all the flack he has been getting for what resulted in a game-deciding drop, is still 5th in the league in receiving with 110 receiving yards on 7 receptions on 13 targets for a 15.7 yard average and no carries, no fumbles, no TDs. Now, what those of you who are tuning in for, I'm sure, who do you pick for the Sunday's games this week for September 14th? As stated last week, during the first 4 weeks, it's the hardest to gauge because you have guys still getting in season shape, teams finding their new identity, and chemistry building. As we saw this week, just take for example, who many consider to be the top 2 wide receivers in the league, and another considered to be a top 10 unanimously. Justin Jefferson had 4 receptions, Jamar Chase had 2 receptions, and A.J. Brown had just 1 reception. Now you got so many people crying about season-long picks and how, pity those who have these guys, and some fans, for some teams, already thrown in the chip because of 1 game. It's just 1 game of a long season, and it's the very first game of the season. It's not going to really dictate how the year of the season is really going to go. Um, like I said, you're really not going to get a good sense of things that, hey, the season is really tending or trending to this way or that way, or this guy or that guy, yeah, projection wise, is being used this way or that way. Really, until after 4 weeks, which is about a fourth of the season. About 25% of the way through the season, you can kind of get an idea, of, okay, well, all right, now guys are starting to really be in season shape, how they're really being utilized, and about what you can really expect. Before then, it it's just statistical guesswork on previous productions, previous years, so on and so forth, right? Uh, I'm honest with you guys. Hopefully, you guys appreciate that, right? Nobody really knows, not even the own players, when you're that early in the season, how things are gonna go. So no sports announcer or anything. They might tell you, hey, they know this, they know that. They don't know anything. It's too early to tell. Myself included. Yeah, I'm projecting these things. I'm predicting these things for you guys, but I'm using past analysis and the way things currently are looking. And trying to combine them to see, like, okay, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm projecting. But it's guesswork at best, right? Because it's 1 week into a 17 game played season, right? So yeah, there's just not enough data there. All right, quarterback suggestion one: Aaron Rodgers. Yeah, he didn't have no 300 plus yard game, and he is still getting used to the guys on his team. Yet he still completed 22 passes on 30 attempts for a 73.3% completion percentage for 244 yards and 4 passing touchdowns. And yes, the Seattle defense did a great job against the 49ers last week, holding them to just 17 points. And they had 2 interceptions. But Rodgers has never been a guy that throws the ball away a lot. He doesn't throw a lot of interceptions. And while they hit the QB 8 times, they only got 1 sack off, though. I believe, even though they show that they have the makings to be a really good defensive team this year, that a veteran like Aaron Rodgers, who showed he still has his accuracy, he's getting to know his teammates, and still has the uncanny ability to spread the ball, throwing 4 touchdown passes to 4 different guys, has what it takes to have another good daily fantasy sports game, point day for you guys. DraftKings, he is going for 5,500 and 7,400 in FanDuel. I believe he will have a stat line of something like 26 for 35 for like 280 yards, and 3 passing TDs, getting you about 23 points. Suggestion two is Jared Goff. And yes, I know they didn't do a whole lot offensively against the Packers, but that wasn't Goff's fault. Uh, he threw for 31 completions on 39 attempts for a 79.5% completion percentage, which was second in the league in completion percentages and first by a good margin for everyone with at least 30 attempts. Heck, the only guy that, that bested him was Jalen Hurts, who only had 18 attempts. Um, he had I think it was like 84% completion percentage, but he only had 18 attempts. Goff threw 21 more attempts than him. That's over twice the amount of attempts, and still had about the same completion percentage. Just kind of give you guys a little bit of record basis on that. Okay, so that's a lot better because um, if you the fewer attempts, right? the easier it is to have either a high completion percentage or a lower completion percentage. Because it takes more misses. Because it takes fewer misses in order to drop it more, and it takes fewer completions to raise it more. So, so there's much more data going this way, right? So, really outstanding job on the completions. And yeah, he also only threw for 225 yards, and that's not a lot of yards. I'll give anybody that. And he had one touchdown and one interception. But the fault isn't in his hands on the game. He was throwing accurate passes, and his teammates weren't producing. They have a great duo in running backs that also weren't producing. It was an off night for the team as a whole. I expect the Lions to come out to make a statement against the Bears, who admittedly looked tough against the Vikings with 3 sacks and a 74-yard pick-6 interception. But they were facing a QB, well, even though he has been in the league for 1 year, it was also his first game as he was injured last year. That's not going to be the case with Goff, who has experience and is one of the most underrated quarterbacks given his stats and yearly progression. I project a stat line of something like 33 completions on 42 attempts for about 310 yards and 4 passing touchdowns for like 28 fantasy points. He's going for 6,000 in DraftKings and 7,500 in FanDuel. Running back suggestion 1. Going with second in the league in rushing yards, Travis Etienne Jr. Granted, I would certainly rate the Bengals defense above the Panthers, but he had a very strong game, and it's not the first game he has had like this. Now, I don't expect the same kind of production of like an 8-yard average, but I expect something around 4.8 to 5.2, which still very respectable. For about 20 carries for 81 to 100 yards. Given which side of the fence he's on there, right? But he gets in the end zone with 1 touchdown. Something he didn't get last week, giving you 14 to 16 fantasy points. He's going for 5,700 in DraftKings and 6,700 in FanDuel. Suggestion 2, Chuba Hubbard. While his production on the ground wasn't the best with just 57 yards on 16 attempts, he did notch an additional 32 yards on 3 receptions, just missing the century mark combined. He is the best weapon on the team as far as dependability goes, and is a true dual threat running back, as he can hurt teams both on the ground and in the air. As a lot of you have noticed in recent years, as backfield tosses and slant out routes to running backs have been increasing the game have been increasing throughout the game, that those receptions can certainly increase the fantasy value. As it's not always, fantasy point wise, is not always for running backs, is not always now gone to, who was the rushing leader, right? All those additional receptions and yards there too, can definitely has made some, more valuable than the rushing leader. It happens. We don't think about it, but it's true. Yes, Arizona did a good job managing Kamara with the Saints, but they had a good game all around as a team last week, and they barely tried to get Kamara involved. I'm looking for 14 carries for 3.5 to 4 yard average for about 49 to 56 rushing yards, and 6 receptions for about an 8-yard average for another 48 yards, and 1 TD. I'm giving you about 18.7 to 22.4 points, depending on which platform. And I left out what he is going for. So let me look that up for you guys real quick. I do apologize, guys. He's going for 6,000 in DraftKings. And he's going for 6,400 in FanDuel. Again, I apologize for that, guys. It's definitely my fault. Um, you know, I fumbled there, right? But still, that's good point value, and we would take that, right? Wide receiver suggestion 1, Zay Flowers, the league leader in receiving yards right now. He has shown, last year, he's shown over the last year and a half to have an increasing rapport with Lamar Jackson, and has some big games. He has emerged as a clear first option. Like week 1, he only threw the ball 19 times. Well, 9 targets went to Zay Flowers. That's almost half the target share. And when Flowers gets the ball, when the ball gets in his hands, given his speed, big things can happen. And yes, the Browns can certainly get a quarterback, get after a quarterback. But a quarterback as versatile and can run, or scramble and run, and throw, like Lamar Jackson can, is harder to get to. I expect 11 targets with 8 receptions, so a bit more targets, but a tad worse this week in reception rate. Out of Flowers, but it still gives him one more reception, right? I also don't expect another 20.4 yard average rate. That's just kind of ridiculous, even if you are speedy, right? I expect something more like 14.7 yards. So the yard should be about 117.6 yards, and I see him getting another TD this week as well. So I'm projecting like 21.7 to 25.7 fantasy points. He's going for 6,200 in DraftKings, and he's going for 6,300 in FanDuel. Something I would think about picking up. Suggestion 2. Now, this one can be a little risky, and I'm actually going to tell you about the risk, okay? Hollywood Brown. Especially if Xavier Worthy's dislocated shoulder is still unable to go. That's the risky part. If he is able to go, that's going to get into his target share. Well, I believe Juju Smith-Schuster, I believe he looked better as far as production goes. Because when you look at, the amount of targets versus reception, that catch ratio, Juju Smith-Schuster's, his was higher than Hollywood Brown's, and he did more with the ball. But is what it is, right? Still, Hollywood Brown was looking like the favorite target, and by a long shot. That was a lot of targets that went his way. So since you got Rashee Rice, you still have him on suspension, and if Worthy isn't able to go, so definitely keep an eye on Worthy's injury status. It's definitely something to think about and know. So if you do pick Hollywood Brown, even Saturday, be checking to see what they're saying about Xavier Worthy. Is he active? Is he questionable? Is he doubtful? Is he marked out? Check that. There are different levels of of dislocated shoulders, right? You can have a severe dislocation, in which case, yeah, he's going to be sitting, he's going to be out for like 3 weeks. It could be a minor, and he could be ready to go next week. It also could just be a, hey, look, he should be fine, but we're going to we're going to play it safe with him. As he's one of our options that we have, and one of our highly touted, receivers. We're going to play it safe and make sure he's 100%. You don't really know, so you'll want to keep an eye on that. But Hollywood Brown had 16 targets. Granted, he only brought in 9 of those, as he had a pretty droppy day. He dropped the ball a lot. But that kind of target rate, as he was clearly the favorite target on the field with the speed, I expect him to have the same kind of target share if Worthy is out, and have about 15 targets as they play the defending champions. They're playing they're playing the Philadelphia Eagles. They're playing the Philadelphia Eagles this week, and they're playing them at home. As in at Kansas City, and the Chiefs usually play pretty well there. I expect a bit better hands from Brown this game, corralling in about 12 of those 15 targets. And at about a 10-yard average seems right, and a good place for Brown. So I'm expecting 12 receptions for about 120 yards and 1 touchdown. This gives you about 24 to 30 points. He is going for 5,200 in DraftKings, and he is going for 6,500 in FanDuel. Suggestion 3, Jackson Smith-Njigba. As we know, he is a 3rd in the league currently in receiving yards. Yes, he had 2 fumbles, and that does give you some concern on how trusted he's going to be with the ball, right? But with 13 targets, and the closest to him in targets was 3 and a running back, and aside from that, fellow wideout Cooper Kupp had 2 targets, which was the next after 3, right? It was a far cry from each other, right? So he by far had the biggest amount of opportunities going his way. Not even close. So he has made himself the clear number 1 option for the new quarterback in Darnold. Granted, talent like Cooper Kupp is only going to be in the shadows for so long, but that much of a gap, expect about the same this week, and that is a heavy lean on Smith-Njigba. I'm expecting about 15 targets for 10 catches for an about 11-yard average, getting about 110 yards, and getting that first touchdown of the season, which is going to get you 22 to 27 fantasy points. He is going in DraftKings for 6,000 and 7,400 in FanDuel. Tight end suggestions. These are going to look very, very familiar, as it's going to be the same 2 suggestions I had last week. Suggestion 1 is going to look pretty familiar with last week's, and that is going to be Trey McBride. And while I believe he would have done even more last game, last week, if it wasn't for Marvin Harrison Jr.'s performance, catching 5 of 6 targets last week, but I'm going to call that an outlier performance, as he barely caught 50% of the passes thrown his way last year. So it's going to take more than 1 game for me to believe he has worked on his hands and catching ability to that big of a difference. It's a pretty substantial difference there, right? Now that performance may have caused the ball to go to him more than it typically would have, having a quote-unquote hot hands kind of day. But the tight end McBride still got the most looks and should continue to be the Cardinals' go-to option when going to the air. I'm expecting about 10 targets for 8 receptions for 64 yards, and 1 TD for 16.4 to 20.4 fantasy points. He is going for 6,000 on DraftKings and 7,000 in FanDuel. And there's a reason he is going for the most at his position in both, because he has the most proven upside ability and facing a weak secondary. Suggestion 2 is going to be Tyler Ward. Also, one of my suggestions from last week, right? And I told you the suggestion at tight end this week. We're going to look familiar, and it's the same too this week. Warren, like I said, was a big gamble because we had to wait and see how they were going to use him. And with him being a rookie, and then also the new QB and Daniel Jones, who, despite what he had shown in New York, Indiana Jones, as the media are starting to call him, did a good job. Also, he had the most targets. He was the most targeted player, on the team with 9, and beat out Michael Pittman Jr. By 1 target. And then everyone else was a distant 3, 4, 5, etc., right? In comparison. So it's clear they have plans to make sure he gets involved. And yes, the defense is much tougher this week than last week going against the Broncos. But where they tend to have a bit of a gap in coverage is over the middle and midfield, which is where tight ends typically hang out. So I'm expecting a slight increase in usage as 10 targets and 8 receptions for about 80 yards, and he gets his first touchdown of his career. So that's going to say that he's going to get you about 18 to 22 fantasy points, and is going for 4,500 in DraftKings and 5,500 in FanDuel. Your flex option. I'm just going to give you one suggestion this week. On this one, it's going to be Puka Nacua. Yes, he is costly. I will give anyone that. But, we've been conservative with our money on these picks to have the cap room for it. As we all know, his first 2 years, he has continued to have a rapport growth with Matthew Stafford. And that rapport just keeps growing. Matthew Stafford gets more and more, confident in Puka Nacua every year, every game. He is a workhorse receiver, meaning a possession receiver. So he gets a lot of looks/targets and a lot of catches/receptions. Yes, a new weapon is in town with Davante Adams. So we already knew, was also a workhorse and figured it would get into his bag of numbers possibly. But he still outpaced Adams with 3 more targets. And Adams is still getting used to the team and game over there, and only caught 4 of his 8. Expect Nacua to still be the main target, even after Adams makes a comeback in performance, when it comes to performance, when he starts putting up the numbers that we were used to seeing from him, right? I'm expecting 10 to 13 targets, because it's typically what you expect of Nacua. And still what I'm predicting this week, predicting, 13 targets for 12 receptions and a 12-yard average. So I'm predicting, like 144 yards. And while he was kept out of the end zone last week, I don't see that happening 2 games in a row with a combined total of about 300 yards in 2 games. So I'm going to expect to see, a touchdown this week out of him. This is going to give him a stat line of 12 receptions for 144 yards and 1 TD. So point-wise, it's going to look like 29.4 to 32.4 fantasy points. He's going for 7,600 in DraftKings, and he's going for 8,400 in FanDuel. Your defense suggestions is always the biggest toss-up, as usually points are close throughout, and not a lot of points. But suggestion 1 is going to be the LA Rams. They are going against the Tennessee Titans, and like I predicted last week, given them having a rookie QB who will take time to adjust to the speed and play of the NFL and having a lack of weapons. Um, I predicted that it was going to look unpleasant for Cam Ward out there, and it did. And offensively, I would certainly suggest that the Texans are a better team than the Titans offensively. Granted, it's a different week and anything can happen, but I would suggest another under 10 points allowed game for the Rams, and five sacks instead of 3 this week. And I'll still say they get 1 interception. So I'm expecting this defense to score for you about 12 points. DraftKings, they're going for 3,100, and FanDuel, they're going for 4,500. Suggestion 2, the Saints. And yes, a better team this week than last week, but the 5 sacks were no joke, and given fewer receiving options this year, for Purdy, he's gonna need a bit more time to throw this year. So I'm looking for a similar amount of sacks this game from the Saints and getting you about 7 points. They are going for 2,500 in DraftKings and 3,000 in FanDuel. I want to thank you again for tuning in to Bud's Hot Sports Takes with me, Bud. And, feel free to subscribe. Feel free to like or dislike, and feel free to comment. You can do all these things below. And, also don't forget to tune in next week. Thank you, guys. This is Bud's Hot Sports Take with Bud. Bud out.